This is a family genealogy journey, the hunt for Will Reed. Genealogy research is not for the faint of heart. I mean, it takes a lot of time and dedication because it's some painstaking work. You are literally sitting there scrolling, looking for a name and possibly a date, and it could be spelled wrong or whatever. So it takes a lot of time and dedication because it's really not easy. I've come across a lot of issues researching, but my top four would definitely be number one, African American research in general. There's virtually nothing out there before 1870 that has records for African Americans. In 1860, unless they were freed, they were listed on a separate slave schedules, but there's no names on that. So there's virtually no records for African Americans before 1870. What records they do have, a lot of times that information was given wrong or it was entered wrong. A lot of times these people didn't know that information, so they really couldn't tell. I've seen someone listed the same age on two separate censuses taken 10 years apart. And I've also seen an entire family listed as the wrong race. So you really have to learn how to navigate to be able to do that. 1890, that census was completely, well, not completely, but virtually completely destroyed on January 10th of 1921. So very little information from 1890. And then there's data entry errors. Names were just spelled wrong or they were spelled different. A lot of times these people could not read or write that was given the information. So it was written down the way that it sounded. So sometimes read was spelled R-E-E-D. Sometimes read was spelled R-E-I-D. So again, you have to learn how to navigate through those issues. I've had issues researching Will Reed. Number one, I don't really know his birthday. I have seven documents. One puts his birth year as 1881, five puts his birth year as 1882, and another puts his birth year as 1883. So he seems to be born after 1880, but I really have no idea. Because of that, there's a lack of records. Um, Birth records really weren't a thing until well into the 1900s. He wouldn't be on the 1880 census because he seems to have been born after that. Because of the 1890 fire, there's just a huge gap. Then there's Georgia. Georgia seems to be relevant for Will Reed, but I have no idea why, and I have no idea how. He seems to have spent time in Georgia, but I have nothing to document that. And then lastly, there's no photos of Will Reed. I have absolutely no idea what he looked like because there's no photographic evidence of him. These are some facts that I know about Will Reed. He was tall and slender, seemed to be between 5'11" and 6 feet tall. He was listed as mulatto, so he was very light skinned. And he seemed to have been born after 1880 in Kershaw, South Carolina. The 1910 census. Will Reed first shows up in Louisiana as a 28-year-old man born in 1882 in South Carolina. He's married to my great-grandmother Drusilla. This census was taken April 26th of 1910, and they said that had been married 0 months. So they must have been married in either March or April of 1910. On this census, they seem to be living with the gentleman named Jack Johnson from Alabama, which could be a Georgia connection, but I have nothing to substantiate that yet, so I'm still looking. The 1920 census, Will Reed, spelled R-E-I-D, is listed as a 38-year-old male from South Carolina. He's listed as a mulatto. His birth year is 1882. And on this census, my grandmother is 7 years old. In 1930, Will Reed is listed as a 48-year-old male born in Georgia. The birth year is consistent with 1882, but why did he say Georgia? In 1930, Will and Drusilla have my grandparents, Ruth and Willie Moore, living with them, along with their oldest child, my uncle, Willie Moore Jr. In the 1940 census, Will Reed is listed as a 58-year-old male, so 1882 is still consistent. His birthplace is listed as Louisiana, but I know that's inaccurate. I think at this point, Will is just telling people anything. Him and Drusilla is living with a guy named Joe DeQueer, who I'm fairly certain is a cousin of Drusilla. This would be the last census for Will Reed because he died on April 30th of 1949. I was able to obtain his death certificate, and on that, his parents is listed as unknown. This video will give you an example of how I research. This is what the census looks like. It's handwritten on a form. And on Ancestry, you can minimize it and look at a transcribed version of that. But all of that information is just taken right from the form and it's typed in. And the way that I research, I just look at each page and I scroll through and look at everybody's name. And when I get to the end, I go to the next page, I scroll through and I'm searching for a name. And if I find a name that I like, I jot it down and I come back to it later. So as you can see, I take research seriously. Now, Will Reed seemed to have been born after the 1880 census was taken, but I still decided to start my search there. In Lancaster County, 1880, I looked at 347 pages. The 1890 census was burned, so there's no information on those. In 1900, for Lancaster County, I searched 519 pages. In Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana, I looked at 651 pages looking for some type of family relationship for Will Reed. And unfortunately, I didn't find anything. So I hit somewhat of a dead end. But on April 21st, 2018, I joined Ancestry DNA. And that gave me a lot of hope because guess what happened?